So Neil had asked me to talk a little bit about kind of the cost questions, the cost-benefit questions, and these are critical questions because, you know, these are the types of analyses that are used to justify government expenditures on public transit, public transportation, or to criticize government expenditures on public transportation. So thinking about this issue right is essential if we're going to be making the types of arguments that we need to justify the type of investment that is necessary in transit operations funding in Los Angeles as we move forward. Obviously, being able to get around, being able to go to the doctor, being able to get to school, being able to get to your job, increased productivity, equitable concerns for those who are unable to get around any other way, like I was when I was a kid and in college, and economic savings from not having to own a car and all those associated costs, which, particularly for low-income people, vastly increase the ability to buy things like medicine, good food, you know, all of the things that, you know, these are the sort of severe trade-offs that low-income people are dealing with in transportation, which, after housing, is the second largest expenditure for most low-income people. There are also indirect impacts on non-users. Obviously, you know, there are congestion benefits. When other people take transit, people who use private transportation are benefiting from that through increased room on existing roads. There's costs associated with parking. Obviously, if you drive to your destination, you have to find a piece of real estate to place your 2 tons or 1 ton of metal while you're doing whatever you're doing. In urban areas, that's a very significant cost, both to businesses and to the extent that is passed on to individuals, which is not the case, usually at least the full cost, to businesses. Transit users don't impose those costs on businesses. There are obviously societal benefits. I mean, that's the reason why we're all here today. We're clean air advocates. We're concerned about energy dependence. We're concerned about the environment, nanoparticulates, fine particulates, health from, you know, basically getting out of the sedentary effects of sitting in a car. I mean, these are things that we all know. Land consumption, clearly automobiles induce land patterns which increase consumption of land by massive amounts. And finally, there's less stress on things like road infrastructure. I mean, the largest single cost moving forward into the RTP is going to be on maintaining our existing system of roads. It's a massive cost, and it could skyrocket if something happened to it in a moderate to severe earthquake. These are the kinds of costs that an auto-dependent system will impose. But, you know, that's the academic analysis. I'm going to suggest a non-academic analysis. And the non-academic analysis, I think, really boils down to this sort of human nature tendency, which is you don't really know what you have until it's gone. And if we didn't have a transit system, what would happen? Well, we have some evidence from transit strikes. There was a transit strike in 2000 in LA. It lasted between 1 and 2 months, I believe. I think it was over 1 month. It stranded 500,000 transit-dependent people who couldn't get to school, couldn't get to the doctor, couldn't get to their jobs. That was the most obvious cost. But there was also a cost to everyone, even folks who used the car. For automobile users, peak hour speeds declined 20% during that strike. And the average length of the rush hour increased 200%. So everybody paid, and they paid dearly.
3 critical pieces that we believe that we need to be a part of as an organization that is focused around civil rights and environmental justice. One of those is the ongoing protection of the existing bus system through preserving it. So preserving our gains, that we added over 1 million hours in bus service, and keeping fares low. Both things we know increase ridership. The second thing is really understanding the very important role that grassroots groups play in building a presence in Sacramento. right? So many people will say, well, we haven't seen a whole lot of transit justice organizations or transit-oriented people lobbying for more operating dollars. So we've seen an increase in that in the last couple of years, and the Bus Riders Union was an important part of a grassroots and advocacy coalition. So we see ourselves as playing a very critical role in trying to leverage more funding for operating dollars at the state level, along with other policy advocates. And lastly, we see ourselves as a very critical part of the national debate. So we have formed a national organization called Transit Riders for Public Transportation, and I want to focus a little bit on the demands. And this national campaign is made up of about 20 organizations that do civil rights, environmental justice work, that are made up of train and bus riders all across the country, and who have a civil rights platform. But in Los Angeles, we believe we need to preserve and expand our current bus system. We need to keep fares low. We also understand that, as Denny and his friends promote 3010, which is now America Fast Forward, that the bus system will be very critical, right? Rail riders need the bus to access rail.
And I hope that there will be Transit Riders Coalition emerging from the kind of dialogue that we're having in Los Angeles today, so that the transit riders on the rail system and the bus riders on the bus system are recognized as common users of a public transit system that is essential to all our welfare. As to the issue directly before us, which is operating money, first, of course, Measure R included 20% of its money for bus transit and 5% for rail transit. And of course, we had a dramatic recession occur really on the very eve of the election, as you may recall. And while we expected that Measure R money then would be able to be one of the bulwarks for maintaining the low fares that I think the Bus Riders Union appropriately works for, absolutely right that putting fares up and reduces the ridership, and reducing fares increases the ridership, and we have to decide as a society the extent to which we're going to subsidize those activities in order to achieve those goals, both for people who want to drive and for people who need to get to work and school. Those are critical objectives. What I look forward to in the future is we need to transform the relationship between the transportation agencies and the state legislature. Now we have to get permission from the legislature to place any measure before the voters, which is really the only place now where we can create significant new revenue. Transit agencies need to be relieved of that obligation. There is legislation being pondered, maybe submitted soon, to accomplish that with respect to fees on vehicles or fees on fuel for driving cars. Expect to see that in the legislature soon. I think it's a very exciting opportunity. I personally want to work forward to a measure that would be a statewide measure that would reduce local agencies' voter approval requirement from 2/3 to 55% for multiple local agencies, cities, counties, school districts, community colleges, transportation agencies, etc. This is like Prop 39 did for schools, except it would include operating money. This measure, the polling on such a measure runs right now at about 54 yes, 39 no, and that's a year-old poll. Since that time, the governor and others have been talking a lot about transferring authority to the local level. That would help do it if we had that. And I think that 3010 or America Fast Forward and Measure R is going to demonstrate tremendous success in our community. It won't be long before we have 5 projects underway, under construction, and that the community residents and voters begin to see a real future emerging. And at that point in time, we ought to be going back with Measure R2, and the Measure R2 ought to complete the rail system, but it also ought to include very significant additional revenue for operating the bus system. These are simply essential systems for us going forward. We cannot go back to the bad old days of 2007, where we not only had $4 plus gas prices, we also had utterly gridlocked streets throughout Los Angeles County. And at that time, there was zero money in the future budget for Metro for projects. So the optimism in the community now is palpable. One of the few communities with this optimism, working together on a transit system that truly works, bus and rail. We can really have, I think, a healthy environment and a healthy economy.